And here's how Senate Majority Leader, Democrat Chuck Schumer of New York, here's how he described it earlier today.
Senate Democrats are under no illusion that we face difficult odds, especially when virtually every Senate Republican is staunchly against legislation protecting the right to vote. But I want to be clear. When this chamber confronts a question this important, one so vital to our country, so vital to our ideals, so vital to the future of our democracy, you don't slide it off the table and say, never mind. Win, lose, or draw. Members of this chamber were elected to debate and to vote, especially on an issue as vital to the beating heart of our democracy as voting rights.
Well, that's how Senator Chuck Schumer described what's going on. It's time to stand up and be counted on this subject, according to the Democrats. And joining us now to discuss it, ABC News congressional correspondent Rachel Scott, ABC News political director Rick Klein, and ABC News political contributor and former Democratic senator from North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp, former Trump administration official and ABC News political contributor Sarah Isgur. Welcome to all. And former Senator Heitkamp. Heidi, let me begin with you. Watching this, you know, we read in the history books about these great debates on the floor of the United States Senate. I've seen a few in my lifetime. We can romanticize the past. But here's what Chuck Schumer's trying to do, trying to get some public connection between what the Democrats want, what the Democrats are arguing, the urgency of voting rights as an issue, and what happens in the Senate. Is there a point to this, and what stood out to you?
Well, I think what stood out to me is the absolute commitment they have to take a vote, whether you win or lose, and to expose the issue. There's a couple things going on. Number one, the history of the filibuster has not been kind to civil rights. And so the symbolism of having a discussion about the filibuster in the backdrop of voting rights is pretty significant for the Democratic Party. It also shouldn't escape anyone's notice that this is happening during, right after Martin Luther King celebration day. And so this is definitely a must-do for the Democratic Party politically, but it also, I think, is an attempt to raise awareness about what's happening to voting rights across the country. Now, whether people will tune in or whether they're just locked in on their own position, that remains to be seen. But so far, I think, Chuck Grassley, kudos to him for actually showing up and engaging in somewhat of a debate. It'd be nice to see everybody on the floor actually having a discussion.
Well, what we are hearing is interesting. Thank you for that, Heidi. And let me go to Rick Klein, though, on the cold turkey reality here. These bills, the two bills, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis bill, are both doomed, it seems, almost certainly, to fail because they don't have Republican support and they can't break the filibuster that controls what happens in the Senate because at least two Democrats, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, are not going to support changing the filibuster. So what is really what do the Democrats hope to accomplish here? One way of looking at this that's not favorable to them is that they show up every week to have debates and votes on bills that are going to doom to fail, almost like they're advertising their failures to the American people. What is your take on this?
It does make for an odd moment when Senator Schumer says win, lose, or draw. He knows, and anyone watching this debate knows, that the answer is lose for the Democrats. They are not going to get either of these bills passed. There's still a chance. We don't know exactly what Chuck Schumer is going to do in terms of a rules package or a rules tweak, trying to get a one-time exception, perhaps just for voting rights. But as clear as can be, we know that those two Democratic senators, Manchin and Sinema, are not game to change the Senate rules, and so we are stuck. And that, the Republicans will say, is the point. They've not offered anything that gets enough support, bipartisan support, to move forward, to get to that 60 votes that many Democrats in the past and all Republicans now view as sacrosanct. And I think it's been illuminating on the floor what Senator Heitkamp said, how rare it is to see senators engage at all. Senator Grassley admitted, yeah, there were times that he was for changing the 60-vote threshold, as when he changed it to allow the Supreme Court confirmations under President Trump to go forward with just 50 votes. So there's been double standards, hypocrisy in both parties over time. There's been a sliding away from that the 60-vote threshold on nominations. We've seen it already happen on budget matters through the reconciliation process. So there are chances and opportunities to change the rules. It just is a matter of Democrats or Republicans in previous times and maybe future times being united enough to do it. And that's where this gets so interesting. It is Democrats standing in their own way. All 50 Democrats support the bills that we're talking about, but all 50 Democrats do not support changing the Senate rules. That was true last week, last month, last year. It was true when President Biden gave the speech in Atlanta a week ago. It was true on the anniversary of January 6th. And in all likelihood, it is going to remain true at the end of this very consequential week. Whatever debate goes on out there, we know how the story is going to end.
It is, in one view, an exercise in futility, a lost cause. But who was it who said lost causes are the only causes worth fighting for? That's the way the Democrats feel, I suppose. Sarah, let's talk about the substance of these bills being debated. They've combined two bills, the Freedom to Vote Act. That has a raft of federal reforms and federal standards, making Election Day a federal holiday, for example, as it is in most countries. Expand early voting and mail-in voting. Restore election rights, for example, voting rights to convicted felons who've paid their debt to society and come out and trying to start a new life. The bills also include a measure named after civil rights leader John Lewis, as I said, that beefs up federal oversight of state laws, an oversight that was struck down by the Supreme Court several years ago. So, Sarah, what are the strongest Republican arguments against making voting easier and safer for most people, including in particular those people who our country has had a history of trying to block from voting, of trying to obstruct from voting, or not counting their votes? What's the best argument against that?
Well, I think we have to put this in a larger context. We now know that the White House and Democrats never reached out to, for instance, Mitt Romney to talk about what it would take to get Republicans to support either of these bills. I think that's interesting because it actually means that the White House knew that this was never going to move forward and maybe didn't want it to move forward. They see this more as a wedge issue heading into the 2022 midterms, a way to get progressives out to vote who would otherwise stay home. I think there are plenty of things that Republicans would actually support in this legislation if the White House had been interested in working with them. Several of these, for instance, automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, making it a national holiday, 2 weeks of early voting. First of all, a lot of those things aren't happening even in Democratic-controlled states at this point. New York comes to mind. It is much easier to vote in Georgia right now than in the state of New York, and Democrats haven't really been able to answer the question of why they haven't implemented these changes in states they fully control. Again, proving that perhaps this is more of a political wedge issue than legislation the White House really wanted to pursue and get passed. You look back at the 2005 Carter-Baker Commission, chaired by Democratic President, obviously, Jimmy Carter, Republican Secretary of State James Baker. They had several of these proposals in a bipartisan manner, and they were matched on the other side by things that Republicans also wanted. I'm thinking here about voter ID, for instance, something that Democrats have really come around to and saying that, yeah, voter ID makes some sense. If the D.C. mayor is going to require IDs to go into restaurants right now with your vaccine card, then perhaps it makes sense to have those to go vote as well. But again, the White House Democrats not interested in working with Republicans to form legislation that could actually get that bipartisan support. Republicans at this point saying they don't want elections run at the federal level, that in fact states are doing, in some cases, again, a better job than Democratic-run states like Georgia versus New York, Delaware, and others.
Well, thank you. It does sound like there's some common ground. There's probably a deal in there on some issues, but the nature of the debate remains a sense among Democrats that some of those changes being made in Republican states, rolling back the ease and access to the ballot in the name of voter security, when all evidence shows that the vote is secure in this country. There's no evidence of any voter fraud of any consequence anywhere in this country, and we know because Republicans have been looking for it for decades. But let me turn to Rachel now. What's going to happen next after the smoke clears? Look, this debate is going nowhere. It certainly seems, at least for this Congress. Progressives are hopping mad. The president's stuck in this cycle of defeats. What's next?
Well, if you ask the White House, they will say continue to fight. But listen, we have seen this story play out before. Democrats have tried to get voting rights legislation passed 4 times over the last 8 months. This is the 5th time that it is now expected to fail, though it is the first time that we're actually seeing this debate play out there on the Senate floor, seeing where Democrats and Republicans sort of stand on this issue, debating this legislation right now as we speak on the Senate floor. So that is a very small victory for Democrats. But again, it is going to be very short-lived when this does come to a vote because they just don't have the votes to get it passed. The question now is there actually areas where Democrats and Republicans can work together as a bipartisan way forward on election integrity, maybe election reform? There are talks here on Capitol Hill about the Electoral Count Act, reforming that, the Electoral Count Act from 1887, which looks at how we certify our presidential elections. Pretty much everyone, Democrats and Republicans, agree that there could be some tidying up of that it's a total mess, that they can be more clear in it. But if you ask civil rights organizations, if you ask progressive lawmakers here on Capitol Hill, they will tell you that is certainly no substitute, they think, for the expansive and sweeping voting rights legislation that's currently being debated on the Senate floor right now.
And isn't really going anywhere. So what about that Electoral Count Reform Act? That Rachel, came into play because as President Trump tried to overthrow the election, even after it was certified by each of the 50 sovereign states and the District of Columbia, that confusion in the middle of that act it left the saving of the democracy up to Mike Pence, who refused to go along with Trump's argument that he could just toss out the verdict of the American people. Do you think that's going to happen, reform of that act and making at least that part of the election, which actually was threatened, more secure?
It is certainly gaining steam here on Capitol Hill. Senator Manchin is working on this with Senator Susan Collins. There's certainly bipartisan agreement that something could be done on this level, that they could actually reach an agreement that could garner the support of at least 10 Republicans. But again, this is not the type of legislation that many Democrats here were looking for when it comes to federal voting rights in this country. And so I think that even if they do take a step forward on this, while it would be a bipartisan win, I think that the White House and the administration, they're still going to receive a lot of heat for not pushing through something that's more sweeping that they promised on the campaign trail.
All right. And Senator Heitkamp, former Senator Heitkamp, Heidi Heitkamp, one of the things that has struck me listening to the debate today is the argument that the filibuster was in some ways made to get more debate going, to allow the minority to block votes for a while so that their arguments could be heard, to draw the attention of the American people. But it had an end. It would come to an end. As somebody who served in the United States Senate, how many senators, could you get agreement to have an old-fashioned kind of filibuster, what they call the talking filibuster, speaking filibuster? You got to hold the floor. You have to speak to the American people. You can't just not show up and say, nah, I'm not going to allow a vote to go forward on that measure.
I think in a normal time, Terry, you could, because people are exhausted. The job satisfaction of an average senator is very, very low because there isn't debate, because this isn't happening. One of the things that wasn't talked about today is that these rules empower leadership. It makes leaders more powerful. And I think that as individual members have lost, because of the cloture votes, because of the rules, have lost the ability to go to the floor, to have debate, to hear their amendments, leaders have basically collected more and more power. I do want to respond to whether this is a ploy, and we don't care as Democrats if it passes. Nothing could be further from the truth. I will tell you, most Democrats are terrified that these so-called voter suppression bills, all of the bills that are being passed by simple majority, as my friend, the senator from Maryland, pointed out, they're being passed by simple majorities in various state legislatures. Those bills will, in fact, have a dramatic impact on electoral outcomes. And so this isn't just a ruse. This is a really important debate for various constituency groups among the Democratic Party, it's important for them to see Democrats have and Democrats defend. Now, whether you win, and it's more likely that it's not going to happen, but this idea that you're going to be able to get 60 votes around some other, more nominal reform, that's not going to happen either, because, as you know, the former president sees any vote for any kind of electoral reform that is bipartisan as a vote of disloyalty. And so we are really stuck here, and it's going to take time moving on, and maybe a movement on behalf of the people to actually change outcomes in Washington.
And Rick, as our political director, let me just ask you about the political impact of this, of the laws that Heidi was just talking about. Across the country, 19 Republican-controlled states have passed laws that do make it more difficult in ways for some people to vote. And about this debate in general, how is this impacting the midterms, say, the status of the parties in the public? Are people just, not really connected?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty extraordinary last week to see President Biden travel to Georgia and so many civil rights groups essentially boycott or soft boycott. Stacey Abrams not showing up. Many civil rights groups saying it's too late to see opportunities for speeches. We need to see action. And the reason is we're getting a real-time text as we speak on this in the state of Texas. Voter registration is underway. Absentee ballot applications are going on right now because the primaries there are March 1st, which means that early voting is in late February. Today we heard from a clerk in Austin, Texas, who said that her office was rejecting between a third and half of the applications for absentee ballots because there were some either irregularities, old forms being used, or because there wasn't an exact match to some of the details around dates of birth, social security numbers on file with the state. So it is possible, if not probable, there will be people who wanted to vote, who knew the old system of voting, who will not be able to vote because of these restrictions. They are different in the 19 states that we talk about. Georgia, Texas have more restrictive, more restrictive aspects to their laws than some other states. But the bottom line is it's going to change state by state. There will be people that can't vote or are frustrated in some way. It's going to take a lot of time for organizers, but I don't know that that's going to be the determinative factor as much as it might be a motivating factor for Democrats.
The concern is that politicians are picking their voters rather than voters picking their elected representatives, but we'll see how that goes. Rachel Scott, Rick Klein, Heidi Heitkamp, and Sarah Isker, thank you very much for that.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.